What if everything you thought you knew about the Garden of Eden was wrong? The story of Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit is one of the most famous tales in human history. But what if the fruit wasn't an apple at all? What if it wasn't even a fruit in the way we typically think about it? For centuries, scholars, theologians, and curious minds have debated the true nature of the forbidden fruit in the biblical story of Adam and Eve. Was it really an apple? A fig? Or could it be something far more controversial? In this video, we're going to dive deep into one of the most intriguing theories out there. The idea that the forbidden fruit wasn't a fruit at all, but a metaphor for sexual knowledge. We'll explore the traditional interpretations, examine the evidence for this provocative theory, and look at what modern scholars have to say about it. By the end of this journey, you'll have a comprehensive understanding of this age-old debate. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or just curious about biblical mysteries, this exploration will challenge what you think you know about one of the most fundamental stories in Western culture. So, are you ready to bite into this juicy mystery? Let's begin our quest to uncover the true nature of the forbidden fruit. To understand the mystery of the forbidden fruit, we need to go back to the source, the book of Genesis. Let's recap this foundational story. According to the Bible, after creating the heavens and the earth, God formed the first man, Adam, from the dust of the ground. God then planted a garden in Eden, a paradise of unimaginable beauty. The Garden of Eden was described as a perfect paradise. Rivers flowed through it, nourishing every kind of trees that were beautiful to look at and good for food. Among these was the tree of life, and at the center of the garden stood the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God placed Adam in this garden to work it and take care of it. He told Adam, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it you will certainly die." Seeing that Adam was alone, God created a companion for him, Eve, formed from one of Adam's ribs. The first couple lived in harmony with nature and with God, naked and unashamed. Enter the serpent, described as the craftiest of all wild animals. It approached Eve and questioned God's command. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Eve replied that they could eat from any tree except the one in the middle of the garden, the tree of knowledge. The serpent countered, claiming they wouldn't die, but their eyes would be opened, and they would become like God, knowing good and evil. Tempted by this promise of wisdom, Eve took the fruit and ate it. She then gave some to Adam, who also ate. Immediately, their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked, covering themselves with fig leaves. When they heard God walking in the garden, they hid. But God called out to them, and upon questioning, they confessed to eating the forbidden fruit. As punishment, God banished them from Eden, cursing the serpent, making childbirth painful for women, and forcing man to toil for his food. This account sets the stage for our investigation. But what exactly was this fruit that had such profound consequences? That's what we're here to explore. Now that we've revisited the biblical account, let's dive into the traditional interpretations of the forbidden fruit. For centuries, people have speculated about its true nature. The most common belief is that the forbidden fruit was an apple. But here's a surprising fact. Nowhere in the book of Genesis does it specifically mention an apple. So how did this idea become so widespread? The apple theory likely originated from a simple Latin pun. In Latin, the word malum means both evil and apple. Early Christian art in Western Europe began depicting the fruit as an apple, and the idea stuck. This interpretation gained further traction during the Renaissance. Famous artists like Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach the Elder portrayed Adam and Eve with apples, cementing this image in popular culture. However, apples aren't the only contenders in this biblical mystery. Let's look at some other fruit theories. Figs. Some scholars argue for the fig, noting that Adam and Eve used fig leaves to cover themselves after eating the fruit. In Middle Eastern traditions, the fig often symbolizes sin and sexuality. Pomegranate. In Jewish tradition, the pomegranate is sometimes suggested. It's associated with fertility and knowledge in many cultures. Grape. Some rabbinical texts propose the grape, connecting it to wine and altered states of consciousness. Wheat. In some Eastern Christian traditions, wheat is considered the forbidden fruit, symbolizing the transition from a gatherer lifestyle to agriculture. But what if the fruit isn't meant to be taken literally at all? Many scholars and theologians interpret the fruit symbolically. In this view, the fruit represents the broader concept of disobedience to God. It's not about the specific fruit, but about the act of defying divine command. The knowledge of good and evil could symbolize moral autonomy, humans choosing to decide for themselves what's right and wrong, rather than simply obeying God. Others interpret it as a coming-of-age story, where the fruit represents the loss of innocence and the burden of adult knowledge and responsibility. Some see it as a metaphor for human free will. The tree and its fruit represent the ability to make choices, including the choice to disobey God. These symbolic interpretations shift our focus from identifying a specific fruit to understanding the deeper meanings within the story. They invite us to consider what the fruit represents in terms of human nature, morality, and our relationship with the divine. But there's another interpretation that takes this symbolic view in a very specific and controversial direction. Could the forbidden fruit be a metaphor for something else entirely? That's what we'll explore next. Now we come to one of the most controversial interpretations of the forbidden fruit story, the theory that the fruit is actually a metaphor for sexual knowledge or activity. This idea has sparked intense debate among scholars, theologians, and laypeople alike. The origins of this theory can be traced back to early Jewish and Christian writings. Some ancient rabbinical texts hinted at sexual undertones in the Garden of Eden story. However, it gained more traction in modern times. Proponents of this theory argue that the knowledge of good and evil refers to sexual awareness and the loss of innocence that comes with it. They suggest that the act of eating the fruit represents Adam and Eve engaging in sexual activity before they were meant to, or in a way that was forbidden by God. Let's look at some biblical passages and interpretations used to support this view. Genesis 3 verse 7. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. Supporters argue this sudden awareness of nakedness implies a new sexual consciousness. Genesis 4 verse 1. Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived. The Hebrew word for knew, yada, is often used as a euphemism for sexual intercourse. The punishment for Eve, increased pain in childbirth, is seen as directly related to sexuality. The concept of original sin being passed down through generations is interpreted by some as making more sense if it's tied to the act of procreation. However, this theory faces strong opposition from many traditional scholars and religious authorities. Let's examine some of their counterarguments. Literal interpretation. Many argue that there's no reason to read the text as metaphorical when a literal interpretation of eating forbidden fruit is coherent. Lack of explicit reference. The Bible doesn't shy away from discussing sex in other contexts, so why would it be so obtuse here? Theological issues. If sex itself was the sin, it would contradict God's command to be fruitful and multiply, given earlier in Genesis. Cultural context. Ancient Near Eastern cultures often used fruit as a symbol in creation myths, but not typically as a stand-in for sex. Textual analysis. The Hebrew words used in the passage are consistent with literal fruit eating, not euphemisms for sexual activity. It's important to note that most mainstream religious authorities reject the sex as forbidden fruit theory. They argue it over-sexualizes a story that's fundamentally about disobedience and free will. Critics also point out that this interpretation can lead to harmful views about sexuality, potentially framing all sexual activity as sinful or shameful. However, supporters of the theory argue that it provides a more mature, nuanced understanding of the text, addressing the complexities of human sexuality and morality. As with many biblical interpretations, there's no definitive proof one way or the other. The debate continues in academic circles and among those interested in biblical exegesis. To dig deeper into this controversy, we need to examine the original text more closely. In our next section, we'll look at the linguistic evidence and what it might tell us about the nature of the forbidden fruit. To truly understand the forbidden fruit story, we need to go back to its original language. The Old Testament was primarily written in Hebrew, and examining the original text can offer us valuable insights. Let's start with the word for fruit itself. In Hebrew, it's pri. This word is quite broad and can refer to any fruit, produce, or even offspring. It doesn't specify any particular type of fruit, which explains why so many different fruits have been suggested over the years. Now, let's look at some key phrases and their potential double meanings. Tree of knowledge of good and evil. In Hebrew, tov vara. While commonly translated as good and evil, it could also mean everything or all things, suggesting comprehensive knowledge rather than just moral knowledge. You will surely die. In Hebrew, mot tamit. This phrase doesn't necessarily imply immediate physical death, but could mean you will become mortal or death will enter your existence. Their eyes were opened. In Hebrew, vadapakakna. This verb is often used metaphorically to mean gaining knowledge or insight, not just literal vision. Some scholars argue that these phrases could have sexual connotations. To know, the Hebrew word yada is used both for gaining knowledge and as a euphemism for sexual intercourse. This dual meaning has led some to interpret knowledge of good and evil as sexual knowledge. Naked, the Hebrew word arom, for naked is similar to aram, meaning cunning, which is used to describe the serpent. This wordplay might suggest a connection between nakedness and the serpent's deception. It's crucial to remember that ancient Hebrew, like many ancient languages, often used euphemisms and had words with multiple meanings. This can make precise translation challenging. Moreover, the text we're working with has been copied and translated multiple times over thousands of years. There's always the possibility of mistranslations or misinterpretations along the way. For example, some scholars argue that the word translated as rib in the creation of Eve might actually mean side, potentially changing our understanding of Eve's creation. It's also worth noting that the Hebrew text doesn't explicitly state that the fruit came from the tree of knowledge. This is an assumption made by many readers, but it's not definitively stated in the original language. While these linguistic insights are fascinating, they don't conclusively prove or disprove any particular interpretation of the forbidden fruit story. Instead, they highlight the complexity of the text and the challenges of interpreting ancient writings. To put these linguistic elements into context, we need to understand the cultural and historical background of the time when Genesis was written. In our next section, we'll explore how ancient Near Eastern cultures might have influenced the story. To fully grasp the story of Adam, Eve, and the forbidden fruit, we need to understand the world in which this narrative emerged. Let's explore the cultural and historical context of ancient Near Eastern civilizations and how interpretations have evolved over time. The book of Genesis was likely compiled around the 6th century BCE, but it draws on much older oral traditions. During this time, the Israelites were surrounded by other cultures with their own creation myths and stories of gods and gardens. Let's look at some intriguing parallels in ancient Near Eastern mythology. The Epic of Gilgamesh. This Mesopotamian poem features a garden with a special plant that grants immortality, similar to the tree of life in Eden. Adapa and the food of life. In this Akkadian myth, the hero Adapa is offered food that would make him immortal, but he refuses it based on poor advice, echoing Adam and Eve's fateful decision. The Enuma Elish. This Babylonian creation story describes the god Marduk creating humans to serve the gods, similar to how God places Adam in Eden to tend the garden. Now, let's trace how interpretations of the forbidden fruit have evolved historically. Ancient Jewish interpretation. Early rabbinical texts often viewed the fruit symbolically, representing wisdom or moral autonomy. Early Christian era. Church fathers like Augustine popularized the concept of original sin, tying it closely to the forbidden fruit story. Middle Ages. This is when the apple became the dominant interpretation in Western Christianity, largely due to the Latin pun we mentioned earlier. Renaissance. Artistic depictions solidified the apple in popular imagination. Enlightenment era. Rational scrutiny of religious texts led to more allegorical interpretations of the story. Modern era. We see a wide range of interpretations, from literal to highly symbolic, including the controversial sex theory. It's crucial to remember that our modern understanding of this story is shaped by centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation. The ancient Israelites who first told this story likely understood it quite differently than we do today. Moreover, the purpose of myths in ancient cultures wasn't necessarily to provide literal historical accounts, but to convey deeper truths about human nature, morality, and the relationship between humans and the divine. With this historical and cultural context in mind, let's turn to how modern scholars are approaching this ancient tale. In our next section, we'll explore current academic debates and interfaith dialogues surrounding the forbidden fruit story. As we've seen, the story of Adam, Eve, and the forbidden fruit has been interpreted in countless ways throughout history. But what do modern scholars and religious thinkers have to say about it? Let's explore some current perspectives. In academic circles, the debate continues to evolve. Here are some key areas of discussion. Literary analysis. Many scholars approach Genesis as a piece of literature, examining its narrative structure, symbolism, and themes without necessarily treating it as literal history. Comparative religion. Researchers continue to draw parallels between the Eden story and other ancient Near Eastern myths, seeing it as part of a broader cultural context. Feminist interpretations. Some scholars re-examine the story through a feminist lens, questioning traditional interpretations that have been used to justify gender inequality. Scientific perspectives. Some academics attempt to reconcile the Genesis account with scientific understanding of human origins and evolution. Psychological interpretations. Drawing on the work of Carl Jung and others, some scholars view the story as a metaphor for psychological development and the human condition. Interestingly, the forbidden fruit story has become a point of interfaith dialogue. Jewish-Christian discussions. Scholars from both traditions compare notes on how their respective faiths have interpreted this shared story over the centuries. Islamic perspectives. While the Quran doesn't mention a specific fruit, Islamic scholars often engage in discussions with Jewish and Christian counterparts about the broader themes of the story. Eastern religious views. Some comparative religion scholars draw parallels between the tree of knowledge and concepts in Eastern religions, like the Bodhi tree in Buddhism. One fascinating trend in modern scholarship is the move towards more nuanced, multifaceted interpretations. Many scholars argue that the story operates on multiple levels simultaneously, as a tale about human nature, a meditation on free will and consequences, and a foundational myth for monotheistic religion. Some even suggest that the ambiguity in the text is intentional, designed to provoke questioning and debate. In this view, the very act of grappling with the story's meaning is part of its purpose. As we've seen throughout this video, the story of the forbidden fruit continues to captivate and puzzle us, thousands of years after it was first told. In our conclusion, let's reflect on what this enduring mystery tells us about ourselves and our quest for knowledge.